The qualification trials at Coronado Naval Base were supposed to showcase the Navy's elite. Instead, chaos erupted when Lieutenant Commander Kiana Ford made a bet that would shatter everything she believed about strength and sacrifice. The base's legendary obstacle course, a brutal test that had broken countless SEAL candidates, became the stage for an impossible challenge. When she spotted Preston Ford, a single father working the night shift as a janitor, she saw an opportunity to prove her point about dedication and discipline. Her mocking offer echoed through the training facility. Complete the course in under 6 minutes, and she'd personally recommend him for any position on base. What she didn't know was that the exhausted man mopping floors had once held records she couldn't imagine. And when he crossed that finish line, the numbers on the timer didn't just break the base record, they shattered her understanding of what true strength really meant. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning briefing at Coronado Naval Base started like any other Wednesday, with Lieutenant Commander Rhiann Vaughn standing before 40 SEAL candidates, her arms crossed, her expression carved from granite. The obstacle course behind her stretched across 2 acres of California coastline, a brutal testament to human limitation, designed to break the weak and forge the strong. Rope climbs, wall scaling, cargo nets, water obstacles, and the infamous final sprint up a 60-degree incline that had candidates vomiting into the sand. Rhiann Vaughn, at 36, was a legend in the special warfare community. 5'9" of pure discipline, with short dark hair she kept military precise, sharp cheekbones that could cut glass, and eyes the color of a winter storm. She'd been the 3rd woman ever to complete SEAL training, the first to lead a direct action unit in combat, and the youngest female officer ever promoted to lieutenant commander in naval special warfare. Her record on this very obstacle course, 6 minutes and 42 seconds, had stood unbroken for 8 years. The candidates before her represented the Navy's best: college athletes, Division I wrestlers, marathon runners, men who'd spent years preparing for this moment. They stood at attention, muscles tense, eyes forward, waiting for her verdict on their futures. Qualification trials begin at 0600, Rhiann announced, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made admirals straighten their spines. Anything over 7 minutes is automatic disqualification. Anything over 8 minutes, you can forget special warfare entirely. The course doesn't care about your college trophies or your daddy's rank. It cares about one thing: can you push past the point where your body screams at you to quit? She paused, scanning the faces before her, looking for weakness, for doubt, for the microscopic cracks that would widen under pressure. Most of you won't make it. That's not pessimism, that's statistics. 70% failure rate. But, for those who do, you'll earn the right to call yourselves candidates for the greatest fighting force on Earth. The speech was interrupted by the sound of a metal bucket clattering across concrete. Every head turned toward the maintenance building where a figure emerged, pushing a janitorial cart loaded with cleaning supplies. The man wore navy blue coveralls with facilities embroidered across the back, his face shadowed by the early morning darkness. One of the candidates, a cocky kid from Annapolis named Barrett, snickered. "Hey, maybe the janitor wants to try out." The laughter rippled through the formation. Rhiann's eyes narrowed, tracking the maintenance worker as he moved across the compound with economical purpose. Something about his movement pattern, the way he carried himself, despite the humble uniform, triggered her tactical awareness. This wasn't the shuffle of someone defeated by circumstances. This was controlled, deliberate, the walk of someone who'd been somewhere, done something. "You think that's funny, Barrett?" Rhiann's voice cut through the laughter like a blade. "You think someone's worth is determined by their uniform?" Barrett's smile faltered. "No, ma'am. I just meant, attention on deck." The maintenance worker had reached the storage building adjacent to the briefing area. In the growing dawn light, Rhiann could see him more clearly now. Mid-30s, maybe 6'1", broad shoulders that filled out the coveralls in a way that suggested muscle earned through actual work rather than vanity. Dark hair, day-old stubble, and eyes that, when they briefly met hers, held something she rarely saw: complete indifference to her rank. An idea formed, dangerous and impulsive, the kind of teaching moment that would either prove her point or blow up spectacularly. She strode across the compound, her boots eating up the distance, until she stood directly in front of the janitor. "You there?" she called out, loud enough for all 40 candidates to hear. "What's your name?" The man set down his cart slowly, deliberately, before turning to face her fully. Up close, she noticed details. Calloused hands, crow's feet at the corners of his eyes from squinting. A faded scar along his jawline that spoke of violence survived. "Preston Ford, ma'am." "Preston Ford," she repeated, her voice carrying across the compound. "How long have you worked facilities here?" "6 months." His tone was respectful, but not deferential, answering the question without volunteering additional information. "You ever run our obstacle course?" Something flickered across his face, too quick to identify. "No, ma'am." Rianne turned back to her candidates, a predatory smile forming. "Gentlemen, let me teach you something about assumptions. You see this man, and think janitor, think civilian, think less than. You see the coveralls and not the person wearing them." She turned back to Preston. "Here's my offer, Mr. Ford. You run this course right now, no preparation, no warm-up, just as you are. If you complete it in under 7 minutes, the disqualification standard for these candidates, I'll personally write you a letter of recommendation for any position on this base you want. Commissary, office work, whatever gets you off night shift." The candidates erupted in whispers. Preston Ford remained still, his expression unreadable. "And when you fail?" he asked quietly. Rianne's smile widened. "When you fail, you mop the candidates' barracks for the next month. Every day, toilets, floors, windows. You'll get very familiar with the smell of 40 men who push themselves to the limit." She expected him to refuse, to recognize the trap, to understand that she was using him as an object lesson about hubris and knowing your limitations. Instead, Preston Ford glanced at his watch, a cheap digital thing that looked older than some of the candidates, and said something that would haunt her for months. "I need to be done by 6:30. My daughter's school starts at 7:45, and I promised I'd make her breakfast and walk her to the bus stop." The casual dismissal of the challenge's significance, the prioritization of something as mundane as a school morning routine over the opportunity she was offering, struck Rianne like a physical blow. In her world, opportunities were seized, challenges accepted, proving yourself was everything. This man treated her offer like an inconvenience interrupting his actual responsibilities. "Is that a yes?" she pressed. Preston looked at the obstacle course, really looked at it, his eyes tracking the rope climbs, the walls, the water obstacles, the final hill. His expression remained neutral, but something in his body language shifted, a subtle squaring of the shoulders, a rolling of the neck that suggested preparation. "That's a yes," he said, "but not for your letter of recommendation. I'll do it to show these kids that the hardest obstacles aren't the ones you can see." He walked to the starting line, still wearing his facility coveralls, still wearing work boots that had seen better days. The candidates gathered along the course perimeter, no longer laughing, sensing that something unexpected was about to happen. Rianne pulled out her stopwatch, positioned herself at the finish line, and raised her arm. "On your mark," she called out. Preston Ford settled into a starting position that looked disturbingly professional. "Get set." His breathing slowed, his focus narrowed. "Go." What happened next would become base legend, the story told and retold in whispered conversations, the moment that changed everything. Rianne Vaughn had learned about strength the way most people learn about mortality, through sudden, irrevocable loss that redefines everything that comes after. She'd been 12 years old, living in a small town outside of Pensacola, when her older brother Ethan had enlisted in the Navy. He'd been everything to her, the person who taught her to swim, to fight, to stand up to the boys who said girls couldn't do what boys did. 21 years old, full of purpose and pride, wearing his uniform like armor against a world that had always been too small for his ambitions. He'd made it through SEAL training, become part of an elite unit, sent her letters from deployments that she'd read until the pages wore thin. He'd written in his last letter, Strength isn't about never being afraid. It's about being terrified and doing it anyway. Remember that. 3 weeks later, 2 officers had appeared at their door. Her mother had collapsed. Her father, a factory worker who'd never shown emotion, had wept openly. Ethan had died in a training accident, a parachute malfunction during a routine jump. His body recovered from the ocean he'd loved so much. The funeral had been full of men in uniforms, speaking about honor and sacrifice. Rianne had sat in the front row, 12 years old in a black dress, and made herself a promise carved in bone and sinew. She would finish what Ethan started. She would become what he'd been. She would prove that his death meant something by living the life he couldn't. Her teenage years became a single-minded march toward that goal. While other girls experimented with makeup and dating, Rianne ran 5 miles before school. While they worried about prom dresses, she studied combat tactics and physical conditioning. Her mother begged her to have a normal life, to let go of the ghost she was chasing. Her father said nothing, recognizing in his daughter the same relentless drive that had taken his son. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She'd enlisted at 18, volunteered for SEAL training at 22 when the program first opened to women. The instructors had tried to break her, pushing harder than they pushed the men, looking for any excuse to wash her out. She'd endured Hell Week on 3 hours of sleep and pure determination. She'd completed the obstacle course in record time despite weighing 40 pounds less than the average candidate. She'd proven, over and over, that gender was irrelevant when will was absolute. But success came with a cost she hadn't anticipated. The men in her unit respected her competence, but never fully accepted her presence. The women in other Navy roles resented her for making them look soft by comparison. She existed in a strange liminal space, too hard for civilian life, too female for complete integration into the brotherhood she'd sacrificed everything to join. Romance had been a series of disasters. The civilian men were intimidated by her strength, her rank, her complete inability to pretend weakness for the sake of male ego. The military men either fetishized her as some kind of warrior fantasy, or resented her success as a threat to their own. She'd tried, in her late 20s, to build something with a fellow SEAL named Cameron, a man who seemed to understand the demands of their shared life. They dated for 2 years, talked about marriage, about a future that somehow accommodated 2 people whose jobs required them to be gone more than present. Then Cameron had received orders for a deployment that would overlap with hers. He'd asked her to turn down her assignment, to stay stateside, to let him take the operational slot because, as he'd explained with infuriating logic, his unit needed him more. The request had been reasonable by military standards. Someone had to stay back. But Rianne had heard in his words the same attitude that had plagued her entire career. When forced to choose, the man's career took precedence. She'd turned down nothing. She'd deployed. Cameron had called off the engagement via email from Iraq. Since then, she'd built walls that made the obstacle course look like amateur construction. She'd dated occasionally, slept with men who understood it meant nothing beyond physical release, and told herself that connection was a luxury people like her couldn't afford. Ethan had loved deeply, had been beloved in return, and it hadn't saved him from dying alone in cold water. Better to be strong, to be self-sufficient, to need nothing from anyone. Her promotion to lieutenant commander had come with a transfer to Coronado and responsibility for training the next generation of warriors. She was good at it, brilliant even, with an ability to identify weakness and either strengthen it or cut it out entirely. She demanded perfection because she'd learned that anything less got people killed. She accepted no excuses because excuses didn't stop bullets or prevent drownings or bring dead brothers back from the ocean floor. The candidates feared her, as they should. The other instructors respected her competence while maintaining careful distance, understanding that Rianne Vaughn was married to the job in a way that left no room for friendship or casual connection. The base commander had once suggested she needed to soften her approach, to show more empathy to struggling candidates. She'd responded by reducing her next class's failure rate to 80%, proving that her methods, harsh as they were, protected the Navy from graduating men who'd crack under real pressure. She lived alone in base housing, a 2-bedroom apartment that held only the essential furniture, and a single photograph of Ethan in his uniform, smiling with the confidence of someone who didn't know how the story ended. She ran every morning at 0500, trained every afternoon, reviewed candidate files every evening. Her life was structured, purposeful, completely devoid of anything that couldn't be measured by quantifiable standards of performance. People existed in her world as either assets or liabilities. The candidates were raw material to be forged or discarded. The other instructors were colleagues to be worked with professionally but never personally. The support staff, the maintenance workers, the civilians who kept the base functioning, barely registered in her consciousness, except as background functions necessary for operations. That's what Preston Ford should have been. Just another maintenance worker, another invisible cog in the massive machine of military infrastructure. She'd issued the challenge not because she saw him as a person, but because he represented a teaching opportunity. The candidates needed to learn humility, needed to understand that the course was the enemy, not each other. Having a janitor fail spectacularly would drive home the point about preparation and training. She'd expected him to refuse, or to accept and fail within the first minute, proving her point about the gap between confidence and competence. What she hadn't expected was the way he'd looked at that course, the professional assessment in his eyes, the complete absence of fear or bravado. She hadn't expected him to prioritize his daughter's morning routine over the challenge. She hadn't expected the uncomfortable recognition that his priorities, so alien to her own, might actually be healthier than the single-minded focus that had defined her entire adult life. Standing at the finish line, stopwatch in hand, watching Preston Ford attack the obstacle course with a fluid efficiency that made her candidates look like amateurs, Rhiannon Vaughn felt something she hadn't experienced in years: uncertainty. Not about the course or the challenge, but about the fundamental assumptions that had structured her entire world. About what strength really meant. About what happened when the walls you built to protect yourself became a prison you couldn't escape. The stopwatch in her hand continued its relentless count, seconds ticking away, carrying her toward a moment that would shatter everything she thought she knew about courage, sacrifice, and the true meaning of finishing the mission. Preston Ford had once been Captain Preston Ford, Marine Corps Force Reconnaissance, a man whose idea of a bad day involved jumping out of helicopters into hostile territory with nothing but a rifle and the absolute conviction that his team would complete the mission. He'd spent 12 years in the Marines, 6 of those in Force Recon, earning decorations that sat in a storage unit he couldn't afford to access anymore. He'd met Juliana Tate at a military appreciation event in San Diego, back when he was 28, and she was a 25-year-old event planner who'd been hired to coordinate the ceremony. She'd been beautiful in a way that made tactical operators forget about operational security, with long auburn hair, green eyes that sparkled with intelligence, and a laugh that could disarm better than any negotiation training. They'd talked for 3 hours at that event, her asking genuine questions about his work, him making her laugh, with stories carefully edited to remove the classified horror. The courtship had been intense, compressed by the reality of his deployment schedule. 6 months of stolen weekends between training cycles, satellite phone calls from undisclosed locations, emails that said everything except what he was actually doing. She'd said yes when he proposed on a beach in Coronado, both of them understanding that marriage to a Force Recon Marine meant long absences and longer silences. Clara had been born during his deployment to the Philippines, a premature arrival that he'd missed entirely. He'd gotten the notification via encrypted message. Baby girl, 6 pounds 3 ounces, both doing well. He'd held that message in his hands in a jungle outpost, crying for the first time since boot camp, overwhelmed by joy and guilt in equal measure. When he'd finally met his daughter 3 months later, she'd been tiny and perfect, with Juliana's green eyes and a grip that could latch onto his finger with surprising strength. "She's been waiting for you," Juliana had said, and Preston had made silent promises about being present, about prioritizing family, about finding balance between duty to country and duty to the tiny human who'd stolen his heart completely. But Force Recon didn't allow for balance. The deployments continued. 6 months gone, 2 months home, 6 months gone again. He'd miss Clara's first word, her first steps, her first birthday. He'd return to find his daughter treating him like a stranger, needing days to remember who the man in uniform was. Juliana had tried to be understanding, had known what she'd signed up for, but knowledge doesn't prevent loneliness or resentment from building like sediment in a river, slowly choking the flow. The breaking point had come when Clara was 3. Preston had been home for 6 weeks, the longest stretch in years, actually settling into something resembling normal life. He'd been coaching Clara through learning to ride a tricycle, his huge hands steadying her tiny ones on the handlebars, when the call came. Emergency deployment, wheels up in 12 hours, duration classified, location classified, everything classified, except the certainty that he wouldn't see his family for at least 8 months. He'd tried to explain to Clara, 3 years old, and crying because Daddy was leaving, again. "I have to go help people," he'd said. The same explanation that was starting to sound hollow even to his own ears. "But I'll be back soon. You always say that." Clara had sobbed, and the accusation in her tiny voice had cut deeper than any knife he'd faced in combat. Juliana had driven him to the base in silence, her jaw set, her hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. At the gate, before he'd gotten out, she'd said the words that would change everything. "I can't do this anymore, Preston. I love you. But I can't keep being a single mother to a daughter who keeps losing her father over and over again." He deployed anyway, because orders were orders and missions were sacred. 8 months in Africa, training local forces, running operations that would never be acknowledged. He'd called home weekly, reaching voicemail more often than not, noticing the increasing coldness in Juliana's voice when she did answer. He told himself it was the stress, the distance, something they'd work through when he got home. He'd returned to an empty apartment. Juliana had filed for divorce, moved back to her parents' house in Oregon, taken Clara with her. The note she'd left was brief and devastating. "I married a Marine, but Clara needs a father. You can't be both. Choose." The Corps had offered counseling, had suggested he take assignment stateside, had even hinted at promotion opportunities that would keep him in training roles rather than operational ones. But Preston had looked at his service record, at the missions completed and lives saved, and realized something fundamental. He'd been fighting for his country while losing his family. He'd been so committed to being the perfect warrior that he'd failed at being the adequate father. The choice should have been impossible. 12 years of service, a career path to senior leadership, the brotherhood of men who'd trust him with their lives. Against that, a daughter who barely knew him and an ex-wife who'd already moved on. Every military advisor, every fellow operator, every part of his identity told him to stay in, to fight the divorce, to prove he could balance both worlds. But he'd held Clara during his visitation weekend, felt her small body pressed against his chest, heard her whisper, "Don't leave again, Daddy." And the choice became clear. He'd submitted his resignation the following Monday, walked away from the career that had defined him, and moved to Oregon to be near Clara. The transition from Force Recon captain to civilian had been brutal. His skills translated poorly to the civilian job market. Tactical operations didn't help with sales. Combat leadership didn't impress hiring managers looking for business experience. He'd burned through his savings fighting for joint custody, finally winning 50-50 split that required him to stay within the school district. He'd taken whatever work he could find: security guard, warehouse loader, construction laborer. The jobs that required nothing but a strong back and willingness to show up. Each one a humiliation compared to leading Marines, but each one allowing him to pick Clara up from school, to help with homework, to be present for the small moments that built a relationship. 6 months ago, Juliana had gotten a job offer in Portland. Better pay, better opportunities, a chance to restart her life. She'd asked Preston to agree to let Clara move with her, promising generous visitation. He'd refused, which meant finding work in the expensive San Diego area where they'd originally met. The only job he could get that paid enough for rent and met the custody schedule was night shift facilities, maintenance, at Coronado Naval Base. So Captain Preston Ford became Preston Ford the janitor, mopping floors he'd once crossed with purpose, cleaning buildings where men still lived the life he'd walked away from. The other maintenance workers didn't know his history. The officers who passed him in hallways didn't recognize the man behind the coveralls. He'd become invisible, which was fine, because Clara could see him clearly. At 8 years old now, she was brilliant and funny and obsessed with science. She'd made him a card for Father's Day that read "Best Daddy in the Universe," with a drawing of them holding hands under stars. He'd cried reading it, overwhelmed by the realization that he'd made the right choice, that this small person's happiness mattered more than any mission ever had. His body still remembered the training, muscle memory, of obstacle courses run hundreds of times, but his life had moved beyond proving himself physically, until a Navy SEAL instructor had offered him a challenge that meant nothing to her, but everything to him. Not because he wanted her recommendation or respected her authority, but because 40 candidates needed to learn what he'd learned through loss. That the hardest course isn't the one with walls and ropes. It's the one where you choose between who you were and who you need to become. Their first meeting had occurred 3 weeks earlier, though Rianne wouldn't have dignified it with the word meeting. She'd been conducting late-night paperwork in her office, reviewing fitness reports and performance evaluations, when the overhead lights had started flickering. Not the gentle dimming that suggested a dying bulb, but the violent strobing that indicated electrical problems serious enough to trigger safety concerns. She'd called the facility's emergency line at 2200 hours, her voice sharp with irritation. "This is Lieutenant Commander Vaughn. I have a critical electrical issue in Building 7. I need someone here immediately." The dispatcher had promised someone within 30 minutes. Preston had arrived in 20, his coveralls clean despite the late hour, his tool bag professional grade despite the humble position. He'd knocked on her office door, waited for permission to enter, and stood at a respectful distance while she'd explained the problem. "The lights are malfunctioning," she'd said, not looking up from her computer. "It's disrupting my work. Fix it quickly." He hadn't responded verbally, just nodded, and moved to examine the electrical panel. Rianne had continued working, dismissing him from her consciousness, the way she dismissed all support personnel, useful but not worthy of sustained attention. She'd been deep in a performance report when the lights stabilized, returning to their normal steady illumination. "Fixed," Preston had said quietly. The problem was a loose connection in the junction box. Old wiring, corrosion at the contact points. "I've tightened everything and treated the corrosion, but this building needs a comprehensive electrical audit. The wiring is from the 80s, not rated for modern power loads." Rianne had glanced up, ready to dismiss his recommendation as the kind of job security suggestion maintenance workers always made. But something in his delivery, the technical specificity, the genuine concern rather than alarmist exaggeration, had made her pause. "How do you know about power loads and electrical ratings?" she'd asked, curiosity overriding dismissal. Preston had hesitated, his expression carefully neutral. "I used to work in infrastructure before this job. You learn to recognize warning signs." The answer was technically true while revealing nothing substantial. Rianne had noted the evasion but hadn't pursued it. She'd simply nodded, returned to her work, and said, "Thank you for the quick response. You can go." He'd left without another word, but as he'd packed his tools, Rianne had noticed something that stuck with her despite her best efforts to forget it. His hands moved with the precision of someone who'd done more than basic maintenance work. The way he'd handled the electrical components, the diagnostic approach he'd used, the technical language that had slipped out, all suggested training far beyond what a night shift janitor should possess. A week after that, she'd been walking to her vehicle in the parking lot when she'd noticed Preston near the dumpsters, not working but talking to someone. As she'd gotten closer, she'd realized he was with one of the base's homeless veterans, An older man named Frank, who everyone knew lived rough near the perimeter fence, surviving on whatever kindness people showed him. Preston had been giving Frank his dinner, a sandwich and fruit that looked like they'd come from the base cafeteria. But more than that, he'd been listening, really listening. Not the performative attention people gave when they wanted credit for charity, but genuine engagement with whatever story Frank was telling. Rianne had watched from a distance, hidden by her vehicle, feeling like a voyeur but unable to look away. Preston had spent nearly 20 minutes there, sitting on the curb next to a homeless man, laughing at something Frank said, treating him like a person rather than a problem to be avoided. When Preston had finally stood to leave, he'd helped Frank to his feet, steadied him when he'd wobbled, and said something that had made the older man's weathered face crack into a smile. Then Preston had walked away, not toward the buildings where witnesses might see his good deed, but directly to his truck, clearly ready to head home after his shift. The interaction had bothered Rianne more than she wanted to admit. In her world, people performed actions for strategic reasons. You helped others when it advanced your position, when witnesses could report your compassion, when the cost-benefit analysis justified the effort. Preston had helped Frank with no audience, no potential reward, no logical reason except that another human needed help and he could provide it. She'd told herself it didn't matter, that maintenance workers and their personal choices were irrelevant to her responsibilities. But the image had lingered, particularly during meetings where officers complained about resource allocation for veteran services, during budget discussions where compassion was measured in dollars rather than dignity, when she'd seen Preston's name on the facility's roster the morning of the qualification trials, when Barrett's mocking comment had given her the idea for her teaching moment. Some part of her had remembered that evening in the parking lot, had remembered hands that could fix complex electrical systems with precision, had remembered a man who chose kindness when no one was watching. She'd issued the challenge expecting to prove a point about preparation and humility. Instead, as Preston Ford crossed the starting line and exploded into motion, she realized she'd made a fundamental tactical error. She'd challenged someone without doing proper reconnaissance. And in combat, as in life, that kind of mistake had consequences. The first obstacle was a rope climb, 30 feet of pure upper body strength that eliminated 30% of candidates on its own. Most men approached it with visible dread, their forearms already burning from anticipation. Preston hit it at a full sprint, his hands finding purchase with the automatic precision of someone who'd done this thousands of times. He went up that rope like gravity had been suspended, hand over hand, boots barely touching the braided surface, covering 30 feet in less than 15 seconds. The candidates watching forgot to breathe. Rianne's thumb hovered over the stopwatch, her tactical mind already recalculating probabilities. The cargo net came next, a 45-degree climb that required both strength and technique. Candidates typically struggled here, their added muscle mass working against them, their lack of climbing experience showing. Preston flowed up it like water moving uphill, his body finding the optimal path through the netting, his weight distributed perfectly to maximize speed while minimizing energy expenditure. "He's not even breathing hard," one of the candidates whispered, loud enough for Rianne to hear. How is he not breathing hard? 1. Because he's done this before, Rianne thought, the realization settling in her gut like cold stone. Not similar courses. This exact type of training, the wall scaling obstacle, separated casual fitness from combat conditioning. 12 feet of smooth plywood with minimal handholds, requiring explosive power to reach the top edge and core strength to pull yourself over. The fastest candidates managed it in 45 seconds. Preston cleared it in 20, his approach revealing training that went far beyond basic fitness. He didn't waste motion searching for handholds, didn't hesitate at the lip wondering about technique. He simply executed, muscle, memory overriding thought. Barrett, the Annapolis graduate who'd laughed earlier, stood with his mouth open. "That's impossible. That wall took me 53 seconds fresh. He's doing it after the rope climb and cargo net." Rianne said nothing, Her attention locked on Preston as he hit the water obstacles. This section broke most candidates psychologically. Cold water shocking the system. Underwater navigation, disorienting spatial awareness. The transition from water to land sapping whatever energy remained. The designers had placed it 2/3 through the course specifically to simulate combat exhaustion. Preston dove into the first pool without breaking stride, disappeared under the submerged barrier, and emerged on the other side in a smooth arc that suggested water confidence most sailors never achieved. He crossed the pool in powerful strokes that would have impressed the Navy's rescue swimmer instructors, pulled himself onto the platform without using the ladder, and was already moving toward the final obstacles while water still dripped from his coveralls. The wall traverse required candidates to move laterally across a 10-foot section using only handholds, their bodies suspended above a mud pit that claimed anyone whose grip failed. This obstacle had the highest failure rate. Fingers cramping, forearms burning, the psychological weight of previous obstacles finally breaking concentration. Preston moved across it like he was strolling down a sidewalk, his hands finding holds with casual confidence, his core keeping his body close to the wall, his breathing still remarkably controlled. "Check his time," someone called out. Rianne glanced at her stopwatch. 4 minutes, 30 seconds. He'd covered 70% of the course in less time than most candidates completed the first third. The candidates were no longer laughing or whispering. They watched in silence, the kind of attention soldiers gave to someone demonstrating skills they'd thought were theoretical. This wasn't luck or adrenaline. This was mastery, the kind built through repetition measured in years rather than months. The final obstacle, the notorious hill sprint, had broken countless candidates who'd survived everything else. 60-degree incline, loose sand that shifted under every step, 200 meters of pure cardiovascular hell. Candidates hit this hill with nothing left. Their legs already shaking, their lungs already burning, their minds already searching for permission to quit. Preston hit that hill like he'd just started the course. His stride pattern changed, shortened but maintained rhythm, his body leaning into the incline at the optimal angle, his breathing finally showing strain but still controlled. He dug into sand that offered no purchase, found traction through technique rather than force, and powered up that slope with a determination that transcended physical capability. Halfway up, his pace didn't slow. 3/4 up, when candidates typically collapsed, he accelerated. At the top, where the finish line waited, he crossed at a pace that would have been respectable on flat ground. Rianne's stopwatch read 5 minutes and 47 seconds. She stared at the numbers, certain she'd made an error, certain the stopwatch had malfunctioned. But 40 witnesses had seen the same thing, and their faces showed the same disbelief. Preston Ford, night shift janitor, had just shattered the base obstacle course record by 55 seconds. He'd beaten Rianne's 8-year standing record by nearly a full minute, and he'd done it wearing work boots and facility coveralls, without warm-up or preparation. After working a full night shift, he stood at the finish line, hands on his knees, breathing hard but not collapsed, looking less like someone who'd just completed an impossible feat, and more like someone who'd finished a routine training run. When he straightened and checked his watch, his expression showed concern, not triumph. "I need to go," he said, his voice carrying across the stunned silence. "Clara's bus comes at 7:45. I can't be late." He started walking toward the maintenance building, not toward Rianne, not toward the candidates who stared at him like he'd descended from mythology, but toward his responsibilities as a father. As if breaking a base record was less important than making sure his daughter had breakfast. Rianne found her voice. "Wait." Preston stopped but didn't turn around immediately, his body language suggesting that whatever conversation was about to happen was an unwelcome delay. When he finally faced her, Rianne saw something in his eyes she hadn't noticed before. Patience worn thin by circumstances, the look of someone who'd learned to tolerate interruptions but never enjoy them. "Mr. Ford," she said, closing the distance between them while very aware that 40 candidates watched every movement, every word. That was 5 minutes and 47 seconds. "You just broke the base record." "Okay," he replied, the word carrying no excitement, no pride, just acknowledgement of a fact that apparently meant nothing to him. Okay? Rianne felt her tactical mind struggling to process his indifference. Do you understand what you just did? Candidates train for months to break 7 minutes. The previous record stood for 8 years. You just destroyed it by nearly a minute. Preston glanced at his watch again, a gesture that was starting to irritate her. I heard you. Is there something else? I really do need to get home. The dismissal stung worse than any enemy fire she'd faced. People didn't dismiss Rianne Vaughn. They sought her approval, feared her criticism, structured their entire careers around earning her respect. This man treated her recognition like an inconvenience. I made you an offer, she pressed, her voice hardening. A letter of recommendation. You earned it. Any position on this base you want is yours. I don't want any position, Preston said. I work night shift because it lets me be home when Clara wakes up and when she goes to bed. Any other shift wouldn't work. So thanks, but no thanks. He turned to leave again. Rianne grabbed his arm, felt the muscle beneath the wet coveralls, solid and real, in a way that made her suddenly aware of how close she was standing. Who are you? She demanded. Janitors don't move like that. Civilians don't complete military obstacle courses like they're walking through a park. Who are you really? Preston looked at where her hand gripped his arm, then at her face, and something shifted in his expression. The patience cracked, revealing beneath it a weariness that had nothing to do with physical exertion. I'm exactly who I said I am, he replied quietly. Preston Ford, night shift facilities maintenance. That's all that matters now. That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're getting. Rianne released his arm, stepped back, her mind racing through tactical assessments. The way he'd moved suggested military training. Specialized training. The kind reserved for elite units. The age, mid-30s, fit the timeline for someone who'd done a full enlistment and gotten out. The evasiveness about his past, the overqualification for his current position, the emphasis on now when describing himself, all pointed to someone running from or hiding something in their history. Barrett. She called out, not taking her eyes off Preston. Get me this man's personnel file. Full background check. Everything HR has on him. That's not necessary, Preston said, his voice taking on an edge for the first time. I passed all the background checks when I was hired. I'm cleared to work here. Cleared to push a mop, Rianne countered. Not cleared to demonstrate classified training techniques in front of my candidates. Those movements, that course knowledge, that's not civilian fitness. That's specialized warfare training. Preston's jaw tightened. Around them, the candidates had moved closer, drawn by the confrontation like moths to flame. Barrett was already on his phone, presumably calling someone in administration. Let me be very clear, Commander Vaughn, Preston said, using her rank deliberately, establishing distance. I'm not active duty. I'm not reserve. I'm not your business, beyond fixing whatever breaks in your buildings. What I used to be, what I used to do, that's not relevant to mopping your floors or running your obstacle course. I did what you challenged me to do. Now I'm leaving. This time when he turned, Rianne let him go, watching him walk away with that economical stride that wasted no motion, disappeared into the maintenance building, and emerged 3 minutes later in dry clothes, carrying a backpack that probably held his work gear. He got into a truck that looked older than some of the candidates and drove off base without looking back. Barrett approached with a tablet, his expression troubled. Ma'am, his file is thin. Like, really thin. Preston Ford. Started 6 months ago. Passed basic background screening. Previous employment listed as various contracting work. No. Military service indicated. Pull his social security records, Rianne ordered. Cross. Reference with DOD databases. Someone with that training has a paper trail somewhere. Ma'am, Barrett hesitated. Is that legal? He's a civilian employee. We'd need cause for that kind of deep investigation. Rianne opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. Barrett was right. Preston Ford had committed no crime, violated no regulations, posed no security threat. He'd simply been better at a physical challenge than he should have been. Her curiosity wasn't justification for invading his privacy, but as she stood there, stopwatch still in her hand showing an impossible time, watching the space where his truck had disappeared, Rianne Vaughn felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Genuine fascination. Not with his physical capabilities, though those were remarkable. With his priorities, with his absolute refusal to leverage his skills for advancement, with the way he'd looked at her offer of opportunity, like it was worthless, compared to making his daughter breakfast. In her world, people competed, climbed, fought for every advantage. Preston Ford had just demonstrated abilities that should have bought him access, respect, opportunity, and he'd walked away from all of it without hesitation because a school bus didn't wait and a promise to his daughter mattered more than glory. "Ma'am?" Barrett prompted. "What do you want us to do?" Rianne looked at her candidates, who stood waiting for her to process what they'd all witnessed, to explain how someone invisible had just demonstrated that visibility meant nothing compared to competence. "Dismiss the class," she said quietly. "Qualification trials are postponed until tomorrow. Everyone needs time to recalibrate their understanding of what's possible." As the candidates dispersed, whispering among themselves, Rianne stayed at the finish line, looking at the course that had just been conquered by someone who shouldn't have been able to touch her record, let alone obliterate it. Rianne told herself she wasn't looking for Preston Ford. She was simply conducting her normal rounds, ensuring facility maintenance met standards, checking that equipment functioned properly. The fact that these inspections happened to coincide with night shift schedules was purely coincidental. She found him 3 nights later in the equipment storage facility, repairing a hydraulic lift that the day shift had declared beyond fixing. He worked under fluorescent lights that cast harsh shadows across his face, his hands moving through the machinery with the same precision she'd seen on the obstacle course. He didn't look up when she entered, didn't acknowledge her presence, just continued working. The day crew said that lift needed replacing. Rianne said, standing at a distance that was professionally appropriate but felt oddly wrong. Day crew was wrong. Preston replied without stopping his work. The hydraulic cylinder seized because nobody's been maintaining the seals. I've cleaned it, replaced the damaged components, and it'll work fine now. Cheaper than a new lift, and just as effective. She watched him work for several minutes, noticing details she'd missed before. The way he organized his tools, each one returned to its exact place after use. The methodical approach to problem solving, breaking complex issues into manageable steps. The complete focus that blocked out everything except the task at hand. "You were Force Recon," she said quietly. Not a question, a statement based on research she'd conducted despite her better judgment. Despite Barrett's concerns about legality, she'd called in favors, asked careful questions, and pieced together what Preston's thin file tried to hide. His hands stopped moving, the silence stretched between them like a tripwire, dangerous and waiting to be triggered. "That's classified information," he finally said, still not looking at her. "How did you get access?" "I have connections in personnel. Took some digging. But your discharge papers were filed under your full name. Preston Andrew Ford, Captain, United States Marine Corps, Force Reconnaissance, 12 years of service, Bronze Star, 2 Purple Hearts, a commendation list that would impress admirals. You resigned your commission 4 years ago." She paused. "Why?" Preston set down his wrench with deliberate care, finally turning to face her. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a warning. "That's none of your business, Commander. You're working on a military installation with skills that suggest classified training. That makes it my business. I've passed all security screenings. I'm not a threat. I'm just a maintenance worker trying to provide for my daughter." His voice remained calm, but she heard the steel beneath it. What I used to be doesn't matter anymore. It matters when you break base records. When you demonstrate capabilities that shouldn't exist in civilian life. When you make my candidates question everything they think they know about dedication and sacrifice." Preston laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Your candidates don't know anything about sacrifice. They think sacrifice is getting up early and running until they puke. Real sacrifice is walking away from everything you've built, everything you are, because someone you love needs you more than the mission does." The words hung between them, raw and honest, in a way that military conversations rarely achieved. Rianne found herself moving closer, drawn by something she couldn't name. "Your daughter," she said softly. "You left Force Recon for her." "I left because her mother couldn't handle being married to a ghost who showed up 3 months a year smelling like foreign dirt and classified operations. I left because Clara was 3 years old and didn't recognize me half the time. I left because being the best Marine was making me the worst father." He picked up his wrench again, returning to the lift. "Now if you'll excuse me, I have work to finish." Rianne should have left, should have returned to her office, filed her report, satisfied her curiosity. Instead, she stayed, watching him work, trying to reconcile the man before her with everything she'd built her life around. "I had a brother," she heard herself say. "Ethan, he was a SEAL. Died in a training accident when I was 12. I became what he was, lived the life he couldn't finish. Everything I've done since then has been about honoring his sacrifice." Preston paused again, and when he looked at her this time, his expression had softened. "That's not living, Commander. That's haunting yourself with someone else's ghost." The observation struck her like a physical blow, accurate and painful in equal measure. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with an emergency call. One of her candidates had been injured during night training, possible concussion, ambulance en route. She left without another word, but Preston's voice followed her. "Take care of your people, Commander. That's what matters." Over the following weeks, their encounters multiplied. She found reasons to inspect facilities during night shift. He found reasons to work in areas where she conducted training. They talked, carefully at first, about tactics and technique, about the weight of leadership and the cost of commitment. Gradually, the conversations deepened, moving beyond professional territory into something more personal. She learned that Clara was 8, obsessed with marine biology, and wanted to be an oceanographer when she grew up. That Preston read her science books at night, teaching himself about tide pools and ecosystems so he could answer her endless questions. That he'd saved for 6 months to buy her a microscope for her birthday, eating ramen for dinner so she could explore the invisible worlds in water droplets. He learned that Rianne ran 5 miles every morning trying to outrun guilt that never got tired. That she'd never had a relationship last longer than 6 months because she couldn't turn off the part of her brain that treated intimacy like tactical vulnerability. That sometimes she woke at 3 in the morning hearing her brother's voice in the wind, still 12 years old and waiting for him to come home. The turning point came on a Thursday evening when Rianne was leaving late and heard a conversation near the parking lot. Preston was on his phone, his voice strained in a way she'd never heard before. "I understand it's inconvenient, but she's running a fever of 102. She needs someone home with her. Can't you please just this once take her to your place?" A pause. "I see. No, I get it. Your new boyfriend doesn't want sick kids around. That's fine. I'll figure something out." He hung up, stood there for a moment with his head bowed, then made another call. "Hey, Clara baby, Dad's going to come get you, okay? I know you don't feel good. I'll be there in 20 minutes. We'll watch movies and I'll make you soup. You're going to be fine." Rianne watched him move toward his truck, saw the exhaustion in his shoulders, the weight of single parenthood that never got a day off. She made a decision that would have appalled the version of herself from 6 weeks ago. "Preston," she called out. He turned, surprised to see her. "Commander." "Bring her here," Rianne said. "To the base." There's a medical clinic that stays open for night injuries. They can check her fever, make sure it's nothing serious. And, she hesitated, stepping into territory she'd never explored. My quarters have a couch. She can rest there while you finish your shift. I'll stay with her. Preston stared at her like she'd started speaking another language. You don't have to do that. I know, Rianne replied. But Ethan used to take care of me when I was sick and my parents were working. Someone did it for me once. Let me pay that forward. Something shifted in Preston's expression, the careful walls he maintained cracking just enough to let gratitude show through. Thank you, he said quietly. That means more than you know. An hour later, Clara Ford was curled up on Rianne's couch, wrapped in a military-issue blanket, her fever slightly reduced by medication from the clinic. She was small for 8, with Preston's dark hair and green eyes that studied Rianne with disconcerting intelligence. You're the lady from Daddy's work, Clara said, her voice hoarse from illness. He talks about you sometimes. Rianne sat in the chair across from the couch, suddenly uncertain in a way combat had never made her feel. What does he say? Clara smiled, a small thing made weaker by fever. He says you're very good at your job but that you work too hard and don't smile enough. He says people who don't smile are usually sad inside, and that makes him sad too. The observation from an 8-year-old cut deeper than any tactical assessment. Rianne found herself looking at this small person, fighting fever and exhaustion, but still trying to understand the adults around her, and felt something crack in her chest. Your dad's pretty smart, Rianne said softly. The smartest, Clara agreed. He gave up being a Marine to take care of me. That's the bravest thing anyone can do. And there it was, delivered with the clarity only someone who didn't understand complexity could achieve. Bravery wasn't charging into danger. It was walking away from glory when someone you loved needed you more. When Preston returned after his shift, he found Clara asleep on the couch and Rianne sitting nearby, reading one of Clara's science books about deep-sea creatures. The scene was domestic in a way that neither of them had experienced in years, comfortable and right in a way that terrified them both. She's amazing, Rianne said quietly, not wanting to wake Clara. You've done an incredible job with her. Preston looked at his sleeping daughter, his expression soft with love. She did most of the work herself. I just tried not to mess her up too badly. They stood there in Rianne's quarters, watching Clara sleep, and between them stretched the possibility of something neither had planned for and both were afraid to name. Admiral Seth Newman hadn't built his career by missing details. As commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, he'd spent 30 years reading between lines, identifying threats before they materialized, and eliminating problems before they became crises. Which is why, when multiple reports reached his desk about Lieutenant Commander Rianne Vaughn's unusual interest in a civilian maintenance worker, he paid attention. He'd known Rianne since she was a junior officer, had championed her rise through the ranks, had personally intervened when certain old guard officers tried to block her promotion. She was brilliant, dedicated, exactly the kind of leader the Navy needed for its evolution. She was also his goddaughter, the daughter of his late best friend, and he'd promised on her father's grave that he'd look after her career. The security report was thin but troubling. Multiple documented instances of the commander visiting facilities during off hours. Extended conversations with civilian personnel. Most concerning, she'd been seen bringing a civilian minor onto base after hours, housing her in officer quarters, behavior that violated protocols even if technically within regulations. Seth made calls, pulled files, and discovered what Rianne's emotional involvement had prevented her from seeing clearly. Preston Ford's background wasn't just thin, it was deliberately obscured. Force Recon didn't produce maintenance workers. They produced operators, men trained for missions that stayed classified for decades. Someone with Preston's skills working night shift for minimum wage suggested either psychological damage or something else, something potentially dangerous. He scheduled a meeting with Rianne for 0800 the following Monday. In his office, where rank and authority couldn't be ignored, she arrived precisely on time, Her uniform perfect, her bearing professional. But Seth had known her long enough to see the subtle signs of stress, the slight tension around her eyes, the careful control that suggested emotions being forcibly contained. "Sit down, Rianne," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. When she complied, he slid a folder across to her. "Tell me about Preston Ford." He watched color rise in her cheeks, watched her tactical mind engage, searching for the right approach. "He's a maintenance worker on base, former Force Recon. He's not a security concern." "That's not what I asked. I asked you to tell me about him." Seth leaned back in his chair, his voice remaining calm but firm. "Because the reports I'm reading suggest this goes beyond professional interest." "I don't know what you mean, sir." "Don't insult my intelligence, or yours. You've been spending considerable time with this man. You brought his daughter onto base, kept her in your quarters. That's not standard procedure for a maintenance worker's sick kid." Rianne's jaw tightened. Clara needed medical attention, and Preston couldn't leave his shift. "I helped a single father in a difficult situation. That's called being a decent human being. It's called emotional compromise," Seth countered. "And it's exactly the kind of thing that destroys careers. Do you know what people are saying? That the Ice Queen finally cracked. That Lieutenant Commander Vaughn, who's turned down dates from officers, politicians, and even a senator's son, is involved with a janitor. He's not just a janitor. He's a decorated Marine who sacrificed his career for his daughter. He has more integrity in his calloused hands than most officers have in their entire bodies." The passion in her voice confirmed Seth's fears. This wasn't casual interest or even friendship. This was emotional investment, the kind that clouded judgment and created vulnerabilities. "Listen to yourself," Seth said, his voice hardening. "You're defending him like he's under your command. But he's not, Rianne. He's a civilian with a mysterious past, working a job he's vastly overqualified for. Have you asked yourself why? Why someone with his training and experience is content mopping floors?" "Because he's prioritizing his daughter over his ego," Rianne shot back. "Something you might not understand given your 3 ex-wives and kids who barely speak to you." The words were a tactical strike, designed to wound. And they found their mark. Seth felt anger rise but forced it down, recognizing that Rianne's defensiveness proved his point. "That was out of line, Commander," he said quietly. "Yes, sir. I apologize." But her eyes held no apology, only defiance. Seth stood, walked to the window overlooking the training grounds where candidates ran obstacles that Rianne had once conquered. "Your father was my best friend. When he died, I promised I'd look after you, make sure you achieved everything your talent deserved. Do you know what I see when I look at your record? Perfection, not a single misstep. Not one compromised decision. A career trajectory heading straight to flag rank." He turned back to face her. "And now you're risking all of it for a maintenance worker with a daughter. Do you understand what that looks like? To the promotion boards, to your fellow officers, to everyone who's invested in your success. It looks like I'm finally living, instead of performing," Rianne said quietly. "It looks like you're throwing away everything you've worked for." Seth returned to his desk, his voice taking on the tone of command. "I'm ordering you to cease all non-essential contact with Preston Ford. That's not a suggestion, that's a direct order. If you need maintenance work done, call the facilities dispatcher, like everyone else. If you see him on base, treat him with professional courtesy, and nothing more. You can't order my personal life." "Sir, I can. When it affects your professional judgment, and this clearly does." Seth opened another folder, this one containing transfer orders. "I'm also reassigning you to Naval Special Warfare Group 2 in Virginia Beach, effective in 60 days. You'll be away from this base, this situation, and this distraction. You'll have time to remember who you are and what you're meant to achieve." The blood drained from Rianne's face. "That's not fair. I haven't violated any regulations. I haven't compromised any operations. You're punishing me for having a personal life. I'm protecting you from yourself," Seth replied. "You're too close to this to see clearly." That man, whatever his story is, represents everything you've spent your career rising above. Working class, minimal prospects, a ready-made family that would consume whatever time and energy you have left after the Navy takes its share. Is that really what you want? To end up like your mother, sacrificing everything for a man who'll never understand the demands of your career? The comparison to her mother was calculated cruelty, designed to trigger the fear that had driven Rianne since adolescence. Seth watched it land, watched her flinch, and hated himself for the manipulation, even as he knew it was necessary. "Preston is nothing like my father," Rianne said, her voice shaking. "He doesn't ignore his family or treat relationships like disposable commodities. He gave up everything for Clara." "That's the opposite of my father. And what will you give up for him? Your rank, your career, the possibility of making admiral, of influencing policy, of honoring your brother's sacrifice by achieving everything he couldn't." Seth softened his voice, trying to reach her through reason since authority wasn't working. "Rianne, I know you feel something for this man, but feelings aren't strategy. Feelings don't win wars or build careers. You've been disciplined your entire life. Don't throw that away now for something that will never fit into the life you've built." Rianne stood, her body rigid with control. "Are we done here, sir?" "We're done when you acknowledge the order. No more personal contact with Preston Ford. Professional distance only. Do you understand?" The silence stretched long enough that Seth wondered if she'd refuse, if she'd force him to make the threat explicit, obey, or face career consequences. "I understand the order, sir," she finally said, each word precisely articulated. "Good. Dismissed." She left without saluting, a small rebellion that Seth chose to ignore. When the door closed, he sat heavily in his chair, feeling every one of his 58 years. He'd just hurt someone he loved to protect her career, used her dead brother and absent mother as weapons, and given orders that would break her heart. But careers lasted decades. Feelings faded. In 5 years, she'd thank him for the intervention, for keeping her path clear toward the success she'd worked so hard to achieve. He told himself that, repeated it like a mantra, and tried to ignore the voice that whispered he'd just made the biggest tactical error of his career. Rianne lasted 4 days. 4 days of seeing Preston from a distance, of turning away when he entered rooms, of treating him with the professional coldness she'd perfected over years. 4 days of watching him notice the change, seeing the hurt flash across his face before he'd lock it down and continue working. 4 days of Clara's science book sitting on her desk, forgotten in the little girl's rush to leave when her fever broke. A physical reminder of what she was giving up for orders she wasn't sure she agreed with. The breaking point came on Friday evening. Rianne was conducting her final pre-transfer inspection of the training facilities, clipboard in hand, checking equipment with mechanical efficiency. The obstacle course stood empty under harsh lights, looking smaller somehow than it had the morning Preston had destroyed her record and her certainty in equal measure. She heard the commotion before she saw it. Raised voices from the parking area, one of them young and frightened, immediately triggering her tactical response. She ran toward the sound, hand instinctively moving toward a sidearm she wasn't carrying, and found Preston kneeling beside Clara on the asphalt. The little girl was unconscious, her face pale, her breathing shallow. Preston had his phone to his ear, his voice controlled but his hand shaking as they checked Clara's pulse. 8-year-old female, unconscious, pulse weak and thready. She complained of dizziness and collapsed approximately 2 minutes ago. "Yes, we're at Coronado Naval Base, North Parking Area. How long for the ambulance?" Rianne's training overrode every other thought. She dropped beside them, her hands moving to Clara's airway, checking breathing, assessing circulation. "What happened?" "I picked her up from after-school program. She seemed fine, a little tired. Then suddenly she said she felt dizzy, and her legs gave out." Preston's voice cracked on the last words, the controlled operator breaking under father's fear. "Pulse is weak," Rianne confirmed, her fingers on Clara's small wrist, breathing shallow but steady. "Did she eat today?" "She should have. I packed her lunch, but she's been picky lately, not eating much." Preston looked at his daughter's face, and Rianne, saw something in his expression that shattered the last of her professional distance. This was what real fear looked like. Not enemy fire or mission failure, but watching someone you love slip away and being powerless to stop it. Possible hypoglycemia, Rianne said, making the tactical decision. We need to get her sugar up. The base clinic is closer than waiting for the ambulance. Can you carry her? Preston already had Clara in his arms, standing with the economical motion of someone trained to move casualties under fire. They ran toward the clinic, Rianne leading, using her rank to override the after-hours locked doors, shouting for the duty medic. The next 30 minutes blurred into a chaos of medical intervention. The medic confirmed hypoglycemia, complicated by dehydration, started an IV, administered glucose, monitored vitals, that slowly strengthened. Clara regained consciousness gradually, confused and scared, calling for her daddy. Preston sat beside the medical bed, holding Clara's hand, talking to her in a voice that remained steady through sheer force of will. You're okay, baby. You just got a little dehydrated. They're giving you medicine. You're going to be fine. I'm sorry, Daddy. I didn't eat much today. The lunch you made me was good, but my stomach hurt. Why didn't you tell me your stomach was hurting? Preston's voice carried guilt that Rianne recognized. The guilt of realizing you'd missed something important, failed to protect when protection was your entire purpose. You work so hard, and you're always tired. I didn't want you to worry. Rianne stood in the corner of the examination room, watching this exchange, feeling something fundamental shift in her understanding of strength. Preston Ford, who could complete impossible obstacle courses and survive combat deployments, looked more vulnerable now than he ever had during physical challenges. Because this pain couldn't be overcome with training or determination. This was the pain of loving someone so much that their suffering became yours, magnified by helplessness. The medic stepped out to call Clara's pediatrician, leaving them temporarily alone. Preston looked up, seemed to notice Rianne for the first time since the crisis began, and the gratitude in his eyes almost broke her. Thank you, he said quietly. For helping. For being here. I know you're not supposed to be. How did you know about the order? Rianne asked, already knowing the answer. Because you went from looking at me like I was a person, to looking at me like I was furniture. Someone with rank clearly told you I was off limits. He looked back at Clara, whose eyes had closed again, exhausted by the medical crisis. I don't blame you for following orders. It's what you're trained to do. Rianne moved closer, every regulation she'd ever followed, screaming at her to maintain distance, to remember Seth's orders, to protect the career she'd built. But Clara's small hand in Preston's large one, the fear that still hadn't fully left his face, the realization that she'd spent 4 days following orders that went against everything she claimed to believe, all of it combined to burn away the careful control she'd maintained for years. I'm not following them anymore, she said. Preston looked up sharply. What? The orders. To stay away from you. I'm not following them. She pulled a chair next to Preston's. Sat down close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Admiral Newman, my commanding officer and godfather, ordered me to cease personal contact with you. Said you were a distraction, a career risk, that I was throwing away everything I'd worked for. He's transferring me to Virginia Beach to get me away from this situation. Then you should go, Preston said, but his voice lacked conviction. I'm not worth destroying your career over. That's not your decision to make. Rianne reached out, took his free hand in hers, feeling the calluses, the strength, the tremor that betrayed his fear. I've spent my entire life following orders, building a career, honoring my brother's sacrifice by becoming what he couldn't. But watching you with Clara, seeing how you prioritize her over everything including your pride, it made me realize something. My brother didn't die so I could build walls and call it strength. He died doing something he loved, protecting people he cared about. And I've been so busy being strong that I forgot what strength is actually for. Preston's grip on her hand tightened. Rian, you can't throw away your career. Not for me. Not for this. I'm not throwing it away. I'm choosing what matters. And this matters. Preston, you matter. Clara matters. I spent 4 days trying to pretend otherwise. And it was the most miserable 4 days I've had since Ethan died. She looked at Clara, sleeping peacefully now under medical care. I don't know what this is between us. I don't know if it's love or just recognition of shared damage, but I know that orders built on fear are orders I shouldn't follow. The medic returned with an update. Clara would need to stay overnight for observation, but would be fine. She'd need better nutrition, more consistent meals, and monitoring for whatever had been causing her stomach issues. Preston nodded, taking in the information with visible relief. I'll stay with her, he said. I can't leave her alone. You'll both stay, Rian corrected. I'll get permission for you to remain on base, arrange for temporary quarters, and I'll speak with Admiral Newman tomorrow about why I'm refusing his transfer orders. The confrontation with Admiral Seth Newman happened in his office at 0900 the following Monday, but this time Rian entered without the careful deference she'd always shown. She stood at attention, not because protocol required it, but because she wanted him to see her making this choice as a complete professional, fully aware of the consequences. I'm refusing the transfer to Virginia Beach, she said before he could speak, and I'm formally requesting to continue my position here at Coronado. Seth's expression hardened. That's not how the chain of command works, Commander. I gave you a direct order. You gave me an order about my personal life, disguised as a professional reassignment. With respect, sir, that exceeds your authority. Rian kept her voice steady. I've reviewed the regulations. You cannot transfer me solely based on personal relationships that don't violate fraternization policies. Preston Ford is a civilian employee. There's no regulation preventing our association. There's also no regulation protecting it, Seth countered. I can transfer you for operational needs, and I don't have to justify those needs to you. Then do it, Rian said. Transfer me, but know that I'll file a formal complaint with the Inspector General citing personal bias and abuse of authority. I'll make it public that you're using your position to control the private life of an officer who's done nothing wrong. I'll detail every conversation, every threat, every manipulation, and when they investigate, they'll find that your goddaughter's career has been micromanaged by someone with a personal rather than professional interest. The silence that followed was heavy with everything unsaid. Seth looked at her with a mixture of anger and something that might have been respect. You destroy your career over a maintenance worker, he said flatly. No, sir. I defend my right to have a life outside my uniform. There's a difference. Rian took a breath. You taught me that leaders protect their people, but you forgot that sometimes people need protection from leaders who think they know better than everyone else. I'm trying to protect you from making the biggest mistake of your life. My biggest mistake was spending 24 years trying to be someone else's version of who I should be. Ethan wouldn't have wanted that. My father, for all his flaws, wouldn't have wanted that. And I don't want it anymore. She softened her voice. I'm grateful for everything you've done for my career, but my career isn't my life. It took a single father working night shift to teach me that. Seth studied her for a long moment, and she saw the exact instant he recognized this was a battle he'd already lost. If I allow you to stay, if I withdraw the transfer orders, you understand the position this puts me in? People will say I'm showing favoritism, that family connections matter more than discipline. People will say what they want regardless, but you'll know you trusted an officer to make her own decisions about her own life. That's what good leaders do. The approval for her relationship with Preston didn't come as a formal announcement, but as a quiet withdrawal of opposition. Seth rescinded the transfer orders, citing operational requirements that required her continuity at Coronado. The base gossip exploded for approximately 2 weeks before another scandal captured attention and relegated Rian and Preston to yesterday's news. The Navy's annual Warrior Games provided the setting for their first truly public appearance together. It was a multi-day athletic competition featuring active duty, veterans, and adaptive athletes from all service branches. Preston had been asked to demonstrate obstacle course techniques as part of the opening ceremony, his record-breaking run having become base legend. Rianne sat in the stands wearing civilian clothes, jeans, and a simple blouse that felt strange after years of uniforms dominating her wardrobe. Beside her, Clara bounced with excitement, fully recovered from her medical crisis, and armed with detailed questions about every athletic event. "Is Daddy nervous?" Clara asked as Preston took his position at the starting line. "Probably not," Rianne replied. "Your dad doesn't get nervous about physical challenges. He got nervous when he asked you to be his girlfriend," Clara observed with 8-year-old directness. "He practiced what he was going to say for like a week. I helped him." Rianne smiled, remembering Preston's carefully prepared speech that had dissolved into simple honesty. "I don't know how this works, combining your world and mine, but I'd like to try if you're willing." They'd been trying for 6 months now, navigating the complexity of a relationship between a decorated officer and a former Marine working maintenance. It wasn't easy. Their schedules conflicted, their backgrounds created friction, and the base gossip never fully disappeared. But Clara had gained someone who showed up to science fairs with genuine enthusiasm. Preston had gained someone who understood the weight of service and sacrifice. And Rianne had gained something she hadn't known she needed: a family built on choice rather than obligation. Preston completed the demonstration course in 5 minutes and 38 seconds, improving his own record by 9 seconds. The crowd erupted in applause. Clara screamed with pride, and Rianne felt something unfamiliar and wonderful. The simple joy of celebrating someone else's achievement without calculating how it affected her own status. After the ceremony, after the photographs, and congratulations, they walked along the beach near the base. Clara ran ahead, collecting shells and examining tide pools with the focused intensity she brought to everything scientific. Preston and Rianne followed at a distance that allowed conversation. "Seth spoke to me yesterday," Preston said. "Offered me a position in the training division. Full-time, day shift, better pay. He said they need someone who understands the practical application of elite training." "What did you say?" "I said I'd think about it. It would mean better hours, more time with Clara, but it also means stepping back into that world, being visible in a way I've avoided for 4 years. He looked at her. "What do you think?" Rianne considered the question carefully. 6 months ago, she would have immediately advised him to take it, to reclaim status and position. Now, she understood that the answer wasn't about career trajectory or social standing. "I think you should do whatever lets you sleep at night and show up for Clara during the day. Everything else is just details." Preston smiled, the expression transforming his face from merely handsome to something that made her heart accelerate in ways she'd once considered tactical weakness. "That's not very military of you, Commander." "Good," Rianne replied. "I'm learning that military thinking has its limits." They caught up to Clara, who'd discovered something she declared was definitely a rare species of hermit crab, despite looking exactly like every other hermit crab on the beach. She insisted they document it thoroughly, take photographs, record exact location coordinates. Preston indulged her with patient enthusiasm, and Rianne found herself doing the same, crouching in sand that would ruin her jeans, examining a common crab like it was the most important discovery in marine biology. 2 years later, Rianne stood in a different ceremony, this one featuring Clara, receiving first place in the county science fair for her project on sustainable aquaculture systems. The little girl, now 10 and somehow even more brilliant, accepted her award with a speech that acknowledged both her parents, her dad, who taught her that broken things could be fixed, and Rianne, who she carefully specified was not my mom but someone who shows up like one anyway. Preston had taken the training position, bringing practical field experience to a new generation of warriors. Rianne had made commander and was on track for captain. But the promotion mattered less than it once would have. She still ran 5 miles every morning. But now, sometimes Preston ran with Plies, her, and they talked about everything except tactics. Admiral Seth Newman attended Clara's science fair, having gradually transformed from opponent to reluctant supporter to something approaching family. He'd never apologized for his interference, but he'd stopped interfering, which Rhiannon considered close enough. That evening, after Clara was asleep and the award sat proudly on their mantle, Preston and Rhiannon stood on the balcony of the home they now shared, looking out at the ocean that had taken Ethan and nearly taken Preston during his service. "Do you ever regret it?" Preston asked. "Choosing this over the career you could have had?" Rhiannon thought about the question, really thought about it. She'd turned down 2 promotions that would have required transfers. She'd stopped pursuing command positions that would have meant deployment. She'd built a life that balanced duty with connection, strength with vulnerability, honoring the dead with celebrating the living. "I regret nothing," she said finally. "I spent 24 years proving I was strong enough to survive alone. Turns out, I'm stronger with you." Preston pulled her close, and they stood together watching the tide come in. 2 people who'd learned through different paths that the hardest obstacle to overcome wasn't physical. It was the fear that needing someone made you weak, that love was a liability rather than the only thing that made survival worthwhile. They'd both conquered courses that broke bodies, but this, building a life together despite everything that said they shouldn't, this was the achievement that actually mattered. In the morning, Clara would wake up in a home with 2 people who chose to show up for her. Preston would report to work training the next generation of warriors. Rhiannon would lead her team with the same intensity but greater wisdom. And somewhere, maybe, Ethan would recognize that his sister had finally finished the most important mission, learning that strength without connection was just another form of breaking. 7 years had passed since the morning Preston Ford shattered a base record and began dismantling the walls Rhiannon Vaughn had spent a lifetime building. The obstacle course at Coronado Naval Base still stood, now bearing a plaque that read, "Ford, Vaughn Training Course, where excellence meets purpose." Captain Rhiannon Vaughn, now 39, stood at the finish line of that course on a Saturday morning in May, watching a new generation of SEAL candidates push themselves past perceived limitations. She'd made captain 3 years ago, turned down Admiral Newman's recommendation for her own admiral track, and instead requested to remain at Coronado in a training capacity. The decision had raised eyebrows in Navy leadership circles, but her candidate's success rate spoke louder than political ambition ever could. Beside her stood Preston Ford, who'd risen to become the head of specialized training development, a position created specifically to leverage his unique combination of elite operational experience and teaching ability. At 43, he still ran the course faster than most candidates half his age, but these days he preferred teaching others how to find their own path through obstacles rather than simply demonstrating his own capability. The real reason for this morning's gathering, however, wasn't candidate training. It was Clara. At 15, Clara Ford had grown into a young woman who combined her father's quiet determination with Rhiannon's tactical intelligence and her own fierce passion for marine conservation. She stood now at the starting line of the obstacle course, not as a military candidate, but as the youngest person ever to receive the Presidential Youth Service Award for her work establishing sustainable fishing cooperatives in 3 developing nations. The local news had requested footage of the award recipient running her father's famous course, a human interest story about legacy and achievement. Clara had agreed on one condition, that the filming also highlight the dozens of young people from military families she'd mentored through her nonprofit organization, Fix Not Broken, which provided STEM education and mental health resources to dependents of active duty personnel. "You don't have to do this, sweetheart," Preston called out to Clara. "The course isn't easy, and you've got nothing to prove." Clara adjusted her running shoes, her green eyes, so like her biological mother's, but filled with a determination that was purely her own, flashing with amusement. "Dad, you've told me my entire life that when something's broken, we fix it. When something's hard, we do it anyway. You really think I'm backing down from a stupid obstacle course?" Rhiannon smiled, recognizing her own stubbornness reflected in the teenager who'd officially become her stepdaughter 3 years ago in a small ceremony that mattered more than any promotion ever had. "She's got your attitude," she said to Preston. "She's got yours," Preston countered. "I know when to quit. You two never learned that skill." Clara positioned herself at the starting line, and Rianne raised her hand. "Stopwatch ready. On your mark." Clara's breathing steadied. Her focus narrowed. "Get set." The crowd of candidates, news crews, and Clara's friends from her nonprofit organization fell silent. "Go." Clara attacked the course with a hybrid approach, combining her father's efficiency with techniques she'd developed herself. She wasn't trying to break records or prove superiority. She ran because the course was there, because challenges existed to be met, because her family had taught her that obstacles, whether physical or emotional, were simply problems waiting for solutions. She didn't break her father's record. She finished in 7 minutes and 12 seconds, a respectable time that would have qualified her for SEAL training had she been eligible and interested. But Clara's interests lay elsewhere, in ocean, conservation, and social justice, in fixing systems rather than running courses. When she crossed the finish line, both Preston and Rianne were there to meet her. The three of them stood together, this family built from broken pieces that had somehow formed something stronger than any of them had been alone. "How do you feel?" Rianne asked. Clara, barely winded despite her effort, grinned. "Like I just ran an obstacle course. It was hard, I did it. And now I'm done. Can we go get breakfast? I'm starving, and you promised pancakes." The news crews captured their laughter, the easy affection, the comfortable dynamic of a family that didn't match traditional definitions, but worked perfectly nonetheless. The footage would air that evening, a human interest story about achievement and legacy, completely missing the real story underneath. The real story was simpler and more profound. 3 people who'd learned that strength wasn't about conquering obstacles alone. It was about choosing to run the course together, to celebrate each other's victories, to show up for the hard moments, and to understand that the finish line was never the point. The point was who you became along the way, and who stood beside you when you got there. Admiral Seth Newman, now retired, and serving as Clara's nonprofit board advisor, watched from the sidelines, with something that might have been pride, or might have been recognition that he'd been wrong 7 years ago. Rianne had thrown away nothing. She'd gained everything. That evening, in the home they'd bought together overlooking the ocean, Preston cooked dinner while Clara worked on college applications and Rianne reviewed training protocols. It was ordinary, domestic. Exactly the kind of life she'd once believed was impossible for someone like her. Preston caught her watching him, noticed the expression on her face. "What are you thinking about?" "That obstacle course," Rianne replied. "The one you ran 7 years ago." "Regretting your challenge?" "Grateful for it," she corrected. "You didn't just break a record that day. You broke something in me that needed breaking. The belief that strength meant standing alone." Clara looked up from her laptop. "Are you two being sappy again? Because I'm trying to write an essay about overcoming challenges, and you're making it really hard to concentrate when you're being all inspirational and stuff." They laughed, and the moment passed into the comfortable rhythm of their evening routine. But later, after Clara had gone to bed and Preston had fallen asleep beside her, Rianne lay awake thinking about obstacles and records, about the courses we run and the ones we choose to walk away from. She thought about Ethan, wondered if he'd approve of the life she'd built. Decided he would, because it was finally hers rather than his shadow's. She thought about her mother's note. "Love is weakness," and understood now what her mother had really meant. Loving the wrong person was weakness. But loving the right people, the ones who showed up and stayed and chose you every single day, that was the only real strength any of us ever had. Outside, the ocean continued its eternal rhythm against the shore. Inside, a family built from sacrifice and choice and stubborn refusal to accept that broken things couldn't be fixed, slept peacefully. And somewhere in the universe's vast accounting of human stories, this one, small and specific, and absolutely ordinary, mattered as much as any record ever broken, or any rank ever achieved. The obstacle course would stand at Coronado for decades to come. Candidates would continue to run it, to struggle and succeed and fail, and try again. But the real course, the one that mattered, was the one Rianne and Preston and Clara ran together every day. The course of showing up, trying hard, failing sometimes, and choosing love over fear every single time the choice appeared. That was the record that would never be broken, because it wasn't about time or speed or physical capability. It was about something no stopwatch could measure: the courage to build a life that honored both strength and vulnerability, duty and connection, the person you were trained to be and the person you chose to become. And in the end, that was the only finish line that truly mattered. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.